The NCAA is increasing basketball scholarship counts from 13 to 15, and you know Mark Few is going to use this to give Gonzaga an edge.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Game Time. Folks, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Well, we got a lot of different things to cover here on our final episode of the week. Andrew Nembhard got himself a hefty extension from the Indiana Pacers. We're going to give a full Olympic preview. We're going to talk about a pair of former Zags women's players who are participating in the 3-on-3 Olympic event. We haven't talked about them yet, so we'll get to that. All of that coming up today. But first, a report from Ross Dellinger of Yahoo Sports detailing some of the changes potentially coming to college athletics via the variety of different lawsuits that are happening, House versus NCAA lawsuit, some of the other ones that are being finalized right now. We've seen a handful of changes come through already. The recent one is that, per the Power Conference commissioners, we are going to see an increase in scholarship count for a variety of sports. For basketball, frankly, it is kind of the least impactful. Football is going from 85 scholarships to 105 scholarships. Baseball is going from, I think, 11.7 is what they have historically allotted for baseball scholarships. That's going to go up to 34, a huge jump for baseball. For basketball, the jump is much more minimal. You are going from 13 scholarship student athletes per roster to 15 scholarship student athletes per roster. That is both men's basketball and women's basketball. You can expect they're going to be the same for Title IX purposes for any sports where there's men's and women's. So this change, we'll get into a little bit about what it means in general, what it means for Gonzaga specifically. But from my understanding, it means you have to keep that amount of student athletes on your roster as well. So for basketball, you have to have a minimum of 15. That's not really going to be a significant issue, a significant barrier. I think basically every team, very few teams have all 13 scholarships filled, but there are very few teams, I think, that have less than 15 players on their roster. That would be surprising to see teams with that few actual student athletes on the roster. They just have a handful more walk-on players than I think a lot of other programs do. We've talked about Gonzaga being somewhat unique as a program that has all 13 of their scholarships right now filled. We've talked about John Calipari making a statement a few months ago in the offseason, early part of the offseason with Arkansas, about not wanting to fill all of his scholarships because he feels like he is then basically helping those players grow and develop for somebody else, because he's not going to play all 13 players. So the players who don't play are going to transfer. Now, I don't love that attitude from Calipari. I think take what he says with a grain of salt. I'm not sure how many are on the roster right now. It's not all 13, but it's pretty close for Arkansas. I think I'm not sure how serious of a statement that is. I understand the thought process, the mentality, but that's why I like, what Mark Few and Gonzaga has done. We've talked about this a handful of times on the show, but the ability of the Zags to identify, okay, yes, we're not going to play 13 guys. We know that. They never have. They never even come really close. I think the deepest teams we've ever seen from Gonzaga play 9 consistently. There maybe been a few teams that played 10, but even then, you're rarely getting into 11, 12, 13. That's very unusual. And yes, in the modern era, if you are one of those players 10 through 13 on a roster, you are potentially more likely to enter the transfer portal. That's fair. As a coach, you figure out if you want to keep those guys, you figure out how to keep them. If you don't want to keep them, don't recruit them in the first place. And maybe that's what Calipari is saying, is he's like, well, I don't, there's not 12 guys out there or 13 guys out there that I want, so I'm just not going to fill the rest of the roster. You still got to fill it with walk-ons, which I assume Cal will do. But in that regard, the move from 13 to 15, I'm not sure exactly how significant it's going to be across college basketball. Before we get into what it means, I do want to mention one other rule change that was in this article from Ross Dellinger at Yahoo Sports that we're expecting to see down the line in the NCAA, is all sports are going to become equivalency sports as opposed to being head count sports. What a head count sport is is football, men's basketball, women's basketball. If you are a scholarship student athlete in any of those three sports, your scholarship is 100% full ride. There are no partial scholarships. Other sports, we mentioned baseball having 11.7 scholarships per team. The way that baseball would have a roster of 25 or 30 or 34 or whatever the roster size would be was that they're allocating partial scholarships to players. And I'm just using baseball as an example because it's one of the only other sports that we talk about regularly on the show. But in other sports, in tennis and rowing and volleyball, and et cetera, you see a lot of partial scholarships. Schools will find a way to give you a 60% scholarship or a 40% scholarship or 50 or whatever. And then you may get an academic scholarship on your own and end up being covered in a full ride in that way. That's pretty common in other sports. But in basketball and football, it's never been that. If you are on scholarship, it is covered. If you are not on scholarship, it is not covered. It is 0 or 100. That is now changing. Football, basketball will be allowed to have partial scholarships. So you have 15 scholarship spots, and you also have the ability to give away partial scholarships. So what does this mean? Well, like I said, I don't think a lot of teams are going to use all 13 or 14 or 15 scholarship spots on scholarship caliber athletes who they expect to play right away. Most teams aren't doing that with 13 right now. So the odds of a lot of teams doing that at 15, pretty slim. So I think a couple things are going to happen. You'll probably see more walk-on players getting scholarships, and that is an objectively good thing. It is hard to find an issue with that. Teams do have to allocate more money to these scholarship athletes in order to pay for the scholarships. I could see that being something that is a challenge for certain programs, but by and large, we're probably going to see more walk-on players get put on scholarship. I think maybe you see more red shirts, the way that Mark Few and the Zags have kind of creatively tackled an issue on a future roster by bringing in Braden Smith to be a walk-on this year to take over as the starting point guard in 2025-26 when Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman graduate. And I think that is maybe something we'll see more of, but it takes a significant confluence of factors. It takes a player willing to redshirt and go to a program that is willing to offer them a scholarship and wants them to sit out for a year. That's hard to find. There's just not a lot of players willing to do that, not a lot of coaches willing to do that. I think this could help change that potentially, but I wouldn't expect a significant increase in that area. I think more than likely you're going to see walk-on players getting partial or full scholarships more regularly. For Gonzaga, what this means is fairly clear. And we saw it happen just earlier this week. Graydon Lemke, 6'11" big man from Las Vegas, commits to Gonzaga as a preferred walk-on. For those curious, preferred walk-on are players who are effectively recruited by the coaching staff, but not brought on for a scholarship. Whereas walk-on, like non-preferred walk-ons, are guys who literally showed up at campus, walked onto the basketball team in a tryout capacity. That's the difference between preferred walk-on and walk-on. It's not an official designation. It's just how coaches, like a player like Cade Orness or Graydon Lemke, announcing that they're coming to Gonzaga. That means they're preferred walk-ons, not just regular students matriculating at Gonzaga and then deciding to join the basketball team. So players like Lemke and Orness and potentially Noah Holland, the other walk-on this team, they may end up getting on scholarships next year, partial or full. I don't know if Gonzaga anticipated this potential change. Probably. I don't think this was a secret that this was going to happen for coaching staffs. So I don't know if the recruiting pitch to somebody like Graydon Lemke specifically was like, hey, come to Gonzaga, walk on as a freshman, we'll get you $40,000 in NIL money to cover your tuition, or pay tuition for your freshman year if we can't get you that amount of money. And then next year we'll put you on a scholarship. We got, X amount of players leaving the program. We got 2 extra scholarships. It's easy money. We'll get you on scholarship. We'll get you covered for the rest of your time at Gonzaga. That, I suspect, is the pitch. And it was probably the pitch prior to even knowing officially if they were going to add these 2 extra spots. And now they could potentially put players on partial scholarships. Maybe Orness or Lemke or somebody gets a academic scholarship and it covers part of their tuition, and now they can just use partial scholarship to cover the rest. I don't know exactly how Gonzaga is going to utilize it, but here's what I can tell you. Mark Few and Gonzaga's coaching staff, they always find ways. They find ways to work the system. They find ways to utilize every little advantage that they can and work it for themselves. They have always done this. For 25 years, this has been one of Mark Few's greatest strengths. So this extra scholarship, we may only see subtle things, but things like, recruiting walk-ons who might end up being pretty good, like Lemke or Orness. Those kinds of things are what makes Gonzaga basketball better. Maybe only slightly better, maybe not noticeably better, but they do. And I have zero doubt that Mark Few and the staff have already figured out ways that this rule change, which goes into effect next year, how they're going to use it to their advantage. I may not know exactly what it is, but I promise you they're figuring it out. Well, folks, Andrew Nembhard continues. This story feels like a future Disney movie, a big-time extension for the star guard with the Indiana Pacers. We're going to talk more about that coming up in just a second. But first, folks, let's talk about game time. Minor league baseball season is here. I live about 10 minutes away from a local park, and I love being able to make a last-minute decision to text a buddy and go out to the ballpark and catch a game. And that's why I use Game Time, because prices on the Game Time app, they actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. So with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. And if you're somebody who's concerned that your tickets are going to be bogus, one of the nice things about Game Time is their Game Time ticket coverage is the most flexible customer service policy in the entire ticketing industry. Personally, I love having that peace of mind. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. You want 2 tickets to a Hillsborough Hops game, $25, you can get them for $5. If you create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off that first purchase. So download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. And we're talking about one of my favorite storylines in Gonzaga basketball over the last 5 years. We're talking about Andrew Nembhard. And we're not talking about the Olympics, although we will touch on that briefly at the end of the show. But we're talking about him getting a 3-year, $59 million extension with the Indiana Pacers. Folks, if you want to hear more about this extension from the NBA perspective, Tony East, Locked On Pacers, he does an awesome job. That show is awesome. He also writes about the Indiana Fever. Really, really good stuff. If you want to check out Tony's stuff, Locked On Pacers, great, great, great show. Andrew Nembhard, 3 years, $59 million. The extension runs through the 2027-28 season. This is the maximum amount of money per the NBA rules. I'm not going to get into all the details on that. It's the maximum amount of money that he's allowed to sign on a 3-year deal. So this is basically a max contract for Andrew Nembhard at this point in his career. And the Pacers are also declining a $2.2 million team option for 25-26, which allows them to start this contract extension a year earlier. So basically, instead of paying Nembhard $2.2 million next year, they're going to pay him about $19 million next year. Now, this is beneficial for Indiana, too. They're not just out of the goodness of their hearts throwing an extra $17 million at Nembhard. It works for them. It's signing it now helps them from a CBA perspective. There's other details and stuff, but effectively, this is a partially a goodwill gesture for Indiana. They know how productive Nembhard was last year in particular. It's a way to get a deal done and keep him at what may end up being under market value. 3 years from now, if Nembhard continues to progress the way that he has, if he's getting paid $20-ish million 3 years from now, that may end up looking like a really good deal. Similarly to how when they signed him out of the draft, they drafted him 31st overall, which was a surprise. Most people didn't even have him on draft boards or had him in the late second round. They signed him to a guaranteed contract, which at the time was the highest guaranteed contract given to a second round pick ever. That has since been passed many times, as basically every new player who signs a second round contract is getting the highest or around the highest guaranteed contract in history. That's just how inflation works. That's just how it goes. But the Pacers bet on Andrew Nembhard. They drafted him earlier than people expected him to go, and they gave him guaranteed money before he'd ever set foot on a floor. And now it has paid off for them, and they are going to continue to pay him and give him guaranteed money because this has worked for them. It has worked for him. It is a relationship that seems to be just continuing to be in a positive place. I love seeing that. You love seeing that. How can you not? Nembhard was so good in the Eastern Conference Finals last year. He averaged 15 points, 5.5 assists, and shot 56% from the field in the entirety of the Eastern Conference playoffs last year. In games 3 and 4, In the Eastern Conference Finals against the Boston Celtics, these are the two games that Tyrese Halliburton did not play. Indiana's best player, one of the 15 best players in basketball right now. Those two games without Tyrese Halliburton, Andrew Nembhard averaged 28 points, and 9.5 assists per game. In the entirety of the 2024 playoffs, Andrew Nembhard shot 48% from three. That is the best among players with 25 or more attempts in the playoff series. Andrew Nembhard was the best three-point shooter. No wonder Indiana ponied up $20 million per year to keep this young man in their program for the next 3 years. And I mentioned the Disney story aspect here as we kind of came into this segment. I want to talk about that a little bit more. I love the Andrew Nembhard story. I think it is fantastic. Gonzaga has a lot of great stories. Corey Kispert wasn't ranked in the top 100 of his recruiting class. He was a 15th pick in the NBA draft. Rui Hachimura was one of the most successful players to come from Japan ever. And he gets picked also in the lottery of the NBA draft as a successful NBA career. There are many, 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 many more great stories in Gonzaga basketball history. But Andrew Nembhard began his college basketball career at Florida. He's from Canada. He goes to Florida. He has aspirations of being a one and done. And things don't go great at Florida, not because of him. He played well in 2 seasons with the Gators, but the team around him, this was the Mike White era at Florida, and they were not good. They were not good. So he spends 2 somewhat frustrating years at Florida. He looked at the NBA draft, considered it, ended up coming back to school because he didn't get the feedback that he wanted. They probably wanted to see him in a better system with better teammates. After 2 years at Florida, he transfers to Gonzaga. And like 4 days before the season, the 2020-21 season, the magical year with Jalen Suggs, when they went all the way to the national championship game, didn't lose until they ran into Baylor. Andrew Nembhard gets granted eligibility right before the season begins. Mark Few talks to Jalen Suggs. He talks to Joel Ayayi. He says, "What do you guys want to do? Are we good with him coming into the mix here, suddenly being a part of the picture?" And they said, "Yes, absolutely, bring him in." Nembhard comes off the bench, which was not his plan. He wasn't planning to play at all, but he was not planning to be a bench player for Gonzaga. Comes off the bench in the first half of the season and just plays great and continues to contribute, is super impactful. Mark Few makes a switch in the starting lineup, something he doesn't do all that often, although he did successfully last year. Starts bringing Anton Watson back off the bench. Andrew Nembhard steps into the starting role. That team, which was already great, they just took off from there, were phenomenal for the rest of the year. Nembhard being willing to suddenly get his eligibility and play a complementary role on an incredibly good team, knowing that the next year he gets to take over because Joel's gone, because Jalen Suggs is gone. And then that's exactly what he does. In his final season, his final season at Gonzaga, he has the career best in points, career best in assists, career best in steals, career best in three-point percentage, is the leader for a very good Gonzaga team that was unfortunately upset early in the NCAA tournament by Arkansas. He then gets picked in the first pick of the second round, gets that large guaranteed contract like we talk about, makes the all-rookie second team, should have been an all-rookie first teamer, averaged 9.5 points, 4.5 assists as a rookie for the Indiana Pacers. And then in his second season, his playing time decreases. The Pacers bring in Bruce Brown. They kind of make an adjustment with Tyrese Halliburton's role. He's playing more on the ball. Nembhard is coming off the bench more. He started 63 games in his rookie season. I think he started 47 in his second season. He played less minutes per game. And instead of whining, instead of showing frustration, instead of asking for a trade, which would be very early to do that, instead of doing any of that, he just continues to contribute in the role that he's asked to fill. And then when the team needs him, when injuries and other things impact them in the playoffs and they need Andrew Nembhard to step up, he goes nuclear. 28 points, 9.5 assists in back-to-back games as an average in back-to-back games against the Boston Celtics, the NBA champions. It is a Hollywood story. It is a Disney story, from a expected to be one-and-done talent to biding his time, spending 4 years in college, finding a new program, changing his role, getting picked earlier than thought in the NBA draft, proving the doubters wrong, to now getting a chance to compete for an Olympic medal with Team Canada and making $60 million. It is a beautiful, incredible story for Andrew Nembhard, one of my favorite stories in Gonzaga basketball history. Well, speaking of the Olympics, we're going to talk a little bit about Andrew Nembhard, what his role might be with Team Canada. We're going to do that for every one of Gonzaga's former players or current players. In the case of Yvonne Ejim, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about 2 women's basketball players who are competing in the 3-on-3 event. Haven't mentioned them yet on the show. Feels like a good time to talk about that as the opening ceremonies get underway. All that coming up in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, closing out the show and the week, talking about the 7 Gonzaga players representing the program, representing their country in the Olympic Games. We've talked about many of them on the show before, but there's a few we haven't touched on. So we're going to talk about the 7 players representing Gonzaga, what role we think they might fill with their respective teams. We're going to start with the 2 that we haven't talked about much on the show. That's Sonny Greinacher and Kacie Bosch. Sonny Greinacher played at Gonzaga from 2011 to 2015. She was a 2-time All-WCC player. She was the WCC tournament MVP. Really, really good player. She was there, overlapped with her for 2 years while I was at Gonzaga, so saw quite a bit of her. She was excellent. And she's been playing for the past decade professionally overseas. She's had a handful of stops in various different countries. She is of German descent, has been playing a lot of her professional career in Germany, and has been kind of just dedicated to the German 3-on-3 basketball team for the last couple of years. Germany was one of the countries that qualified for the Olympics in the 3-on-3 tournament. Sonny is on that roster. So we're going to be watching men's basketball 5-on-5 because there's quite a few Zags on that. We're going to be watching women's basketball 5-on-5, especially Team Canada, to see how Yvonne does. But we're also going to be watching 3-on-3 basketball because Germany will be represented by Sonny Greinacher, and then Canada will be represented by Kacie Bosch, another Gonzaga alumni representing Canada at the 2024 Olympic Games. Kacie Bosch played at Gonzaga briefly from 2014 to 2016. I didn't get a ton of playing time in her 2 years at Gonzaga. She ended up finishing her collegiate basketball career in Canada at Lethbridge University. And she's been playing with Canada's 3-on-3 tournament events since 2021. She helped Canada win the FIBA series in both 2022 and 2023. That was how she ended up getting a spot on this Olympic roster. She's now headed to Paris. She's going to be representing Canada and Gonzaga in the Olympic Games. Very, very cool that the 3-on-3 tournament will have a pair of former Gonzaga players on those rosters. Definitely worth checking that out whenever it is on TV, whenever we get a chance to watch those 3-on-3 basketball tournaments. Of course, Yvonne, we're going to talk about her as well. She is representing Team Canada in the 5-on-5 senior women's national team. She has not played much in the exhibition series. This shouldn't be a surprise. Yvonne is not going to be a significant contributor right now for Team Canada. She's earned her spot on this roster, to be clear. She's not like a legacy pick or anything like that. But she's on this roster, I think, in part to be somebody that Team Canada continues to have as a part of their future senior women's national teams. She's an Olympian in 2024, but they're also hoping she's going to be Olympian in 2028, potentially Olympian again in 2020 or in 2032, and in FIBA tournaments throughout the next half decade, full decade or so as well. I think she played like 9 minutes in one of their most recent exhibition games, and I wouldn't be surprised to see her pick up DNPs or just not play a ton of minutes during the actual Olympics for Team Canada. But it's still an incredible opportunity for her to be there, and hopefully she will get some run and some opportunities to play. If nothing else, the scrimmages, the practices with her own teams, like playing against her own teammates, they're going to make her better. Every player is supposed to be getting better in the offseason. There's no doubt that Yvonne is getting better and that she's going to bring that to Gonzaga for her 5th and final season this upcoming year. Talk briefly on the men's players. We have talked about them quite a few times on the show, so it's not a ton of new news here, but just kind of want to lay out, as the Olympics get underway, as the opening ceremonies start, kind of what we expect each of these 4 players' role to be with their respective teams in the Olympics as they get underway. We'll start with Andrew Nembhard, who we just had a lengthy conversation about there in segment 2. Nembhard I think he's going to be a backup point guard for Team Canada. I don't expect him to start for the Canadian team, in part because they have arguably the best or second best player in the NBA in Shai Gilgeous-Alexander on the roster. SGA was an MVP candidate last year with the Oklahoma City Thunder. He's going to start at the 1. Jamal Murray, a lot of the questions for Team Canada has been the health for Jamal Murray. He didn't participate in a lot of the exhibition season, but he is healthy now. There's pictures of him at a closed-door scrimmage against Germany playing. So it sounds like Jamal Murray is healthy. If he's healthy, he's going to start. So you're going to have SGA and Jamal Murray, which is an incredible backcourt for Canada. That's really, really good. You also have Lou Dort in the mix. You have RJ Barrett in the mix. Not exactly the same position as Nembhard, but those guys are in the mix as well. I think Nembhard is kind of your third guard behind SGA and Jamal Murray, which for the record, every NBA team, if you told them they get SGA, Murray, and Nembhard as their three guards, they're taking it. Every one of them. That is an incredible trio of guards to have on your roster. I think Nembhard plays big minutes. I think he's used as a secondary ball handler in certain situations with SGA and Nembhard on the floor at the same time. You have two great ball handling point guards. We know Nembhard's familiar with that role, having done it not only with Jalen Suggs way back at Gonzaga in 2020-21, but with Tyrese Halliburton last year on the Indiana Pacers. So Nembhard's familiar with that role. I think he's going to fill it very admirably for Team Canada in the Olympics. And then you got Kelly Olynyk. Kelly Olynyk's role is the team captain. He's the leader of this team. He's one of the longest tenured Canadian Olympians ever. He's been with Team Canada for a decade, playing in FIBA tournaments, representing them at the Euro Cup, various different places. Canada is in the spot that they are in part because of Kelly. And I think he's not just a legacy captain. He is a significant contributor for them as well. He's probably going to be their starting center. I think he's a matchup dependent player. He's a floor spacer. He's a stretch five. They don't have a ton of size. Not getting Zach Edey hurt them. Edey decided to stay out of the Olympics and prepare for his first NBA season. Can't really blame him, but that stung for them. They have Dwight Powell. They have Trey Lyles. They have some other guys who are decent sized, but they don't have a ton of depth and size in the front court. And so Kelly's going to be relied upon a lot. Some of the things that they're going to ask him to do are probably not within his strengths currently. And so I'm curious how that will work. Like, he's going to struggle with Bam Adebayo and Joel Embiid and Anthony Davis. Now, granted, most teams are going to struggle with Team USA's front court, but the Canadians are probably going to struggle with the French team as well, with Victor Wembanyama and Rudy Gobert. Now, they beat France in a scrimmage game, so maybe they won't struggle that much over there, but Kelly's probably going to draw a lot of tough defensive assignments when you figure Wembanyama and the American team, and of course Nikola Jokic and the Serbians. Like, there's a lot of really good big men in the Olympics this year, and Kelly's going to kind of draw a lot of tough assignments for Team Canada. Last two guys, Filip Petrusev for Team Serbia. We mentioned Nikola Jokic. He's the starting center, but Petrusev has started for Serbia in their exhibition series up to this point. I do know Bogdan Bogdanovic was not playing. If he does play, somebody's going to get bumped out of the starting lineup. Not sure whether it's going to be Petrusev or not. Even if it is him, even if he doesn't start, he's going to play big minutes. The Serbians were very comfortable playing Jokic and Petrusev together. That was something I was worried about, of like, oh, is Petrusev only going to be a backup to Jokic? Because if that's the case, he doesn't get a lot of playing time, but it doesn't appear that that's what the direction they're going. Petrusev's performances against Canada and the U.S. were very, very good. I'm very intrigued. We mentioned this on an earlier show for those of you who may have missed it. I'm curious if Petrusev is in a position where, depending on how well he performs in the Olympics, it could help encourage an NBA team to sign him to training camp. If he looks really good out there against NBA caliber players, against the French team with Gobert and Wembanyama, against the Americans, against other really good teams that are out there, the Germans, the Australians, whoever it may be, I could see that being a situation where an NBA team says, hey, maybe we should give him a call. Don't know exactly what he's looking for, his contract situation overseas, things like that, but it's something I'm keeping an eye on in these Olympics. And then last but not least, because it's the easiest one, Rui Hachimura for Team Japan. He's their best player. He's really, really good. They're going to have him the ball a lot. He's going to put up big numbers. I'm not sure the Japanese team's going to do very good. They're not projected to do very good. Last time Rui was in the Olympics, it was in Tokyo, granted, which adds another layer of pressure. He was also a flag bearer for the Olympic Games in 2020. It didn't go well, and Rui took it really hard, and he ended up missing a large chunk of the next NBA season because of mental health issues. I sincerely hope that does not happen again, but he is going to be the figurehead and the public face for Japanese basketball in the Olympics, and if they don't do very well, he's going to be somebody who's in the news a lot because of that, and hopefully that's something he can handle and puts him in a position to not let it impact his potential professional basketball career going forward with the Los Angeles Lakers. But there's very little doubt in my mind that every game Japan plays, Rui, if he's not their leading scorer, it'll be a surprise. I think he's most likely going to be in that conversation. Folks, that's going to wrap it up for me today and for this week. When we come back next week, the Olympics will be underway. We'll continue to keep you up to date on everything going on with all 7 of these players. We'll keep you up to date on Team USA as well, especially with Mark Few on the sideline as an assistant coach. We'll keep you up to date on recruiting as we keep getting updates on Kingston Flemings and Isaiah Harwell and other players that Gonzaga is pursuing. All that more summer league, but more NBA training camp stuff coming your way as well. With lots of good stuff in the bag coming up on Locked On Zags, so don't miss it. Thanks again for listening. And until next time, folks, as always, go Zags.